Between 2010 and 2017 in Toronto, Canada, men were disappearing from the city's gay village. The subsequent police investigations were criticised with allegations of anti-gay bias. It would take years for the authorities to realise that the disappearances were linked and that they were hunting the deadliest serial killer in Toronto's history. This is a story of a ruthless predator with a penchant for violent sex hiding in plain sight. This is the case of the Santa Claus Killer, Bruce Mcarthur. If you hear some skitting around today, it's because I have both Dolly and Blue in here, a cat and a dog, and they are very badly behaved when I'm filming. But nonetheless, they insisted on being here, and as this is going out to you guys on Christmas Day, well, I thought, why not have the family in here with me? Today's case is Christmas themed because you asked for it. Sorry if you're watching this at late Easter, but I have gone and done a case that is crime and is also Christmas orientated, if those two can ever actually sync together. It's a bit of cognitive dissonance, isn't it, when you have those together? Because Christmas should be about loving and giving and not killing and serial killers. Anyway, I digress before I've even started, so apologies for that. It is an astonishingly awful case today, and that's because genuinely, this guy should have been banged up in prison before he ever had an opportunity to go out and kill anyone else. I'm just going to throw that in there before I actually start this case. So the Santa Claus Killer is his name, Bruce Mcarthur. And essentially, if you imagine Santa Claus and then you imagine the actions of somebody like Bruce Mcarthur, well, we're in totally different universes. So let's go back to when this all could have been prevented. Genuinely. There is nothing more frustrated when I do these cases than when I start to talk about the reality of failures that led to other people losing their lives. So, 35-year-old Mark Henderson. He's a really well-known face on the Toronto gay scene. Now in 2001, he is doing his studies. He's studying to become a registered nurse, says something about his nature, compassionate, caring. Also, he was quite diverse in what he did activity-wise. So he did a bit of acting, he did a bit of modelling, and this was usually in the gay village itself. He was said to be by friends, and certainly it was reflected, as far as he recollects, as a happy and confident individual who really did need a little excuse to get up on stage and perform. And we're going to say that now because what happens to Mark steals some of that. And this is really imperative because I think that Mark is horrendously let down. And you'll understand this a little bit more when I talk deeper about what happened to him. So at this moment in time, he's loving life, he's living life. He's taking advantage of his natural extroverted nature and he's thriving. But every single bit of that description I've just told you changes. On the 31st of October 2001, there's another familiar face on the gay scene. And that familiar face is 50-year-old Bruce Mcarthur. Now, Mark had what I can really genuinely connect with, because I think many of us feel this in our gut. He had that instinct that he didn't like Bruce Mcarthur. He didn't feel sure about him at all. There was something deep within his gut that said to him, I don't want to be around this man. And we are taught, and I'm writing about this at the moment because I think it's such a powerful disabler in what has made us survive for millennia. The idea that that gut, the very survival experience that tells us and informs us whether we should get away from somebody, we are told to ignore it all the time. We're told it's offensive to have these feelings. We're told that we shouldn't judge people and so on and so forth. And we absolutely know that we should certainly, when people are good people, give them a chance. But when you have this deep down gut feeling, this cerebral and visceral connection with something that feels off, listen to it. Ignore all those people who tell you to challenge those feelings because maybe you've got a bias. Listen, some people do. Some people are biased, some people are prejudiced, some people are just that way. But we're not going to change those people. The only people that we really challenge and change in that moment by suggesting we should ignore our intuition and instinct are people who are actually good and are trying not to be people who upset others. And so we're essentially disabling their survival mechanism by making them second guess whether they're allowed to act on this feeling. And it's paramount so often to tune into that gut, to listen to that feeling that says, I don't like being around this person, because it is your natural animalistic instinct that is trying to protect you. And how often have we overridden that genuine instinct and allowed somebody into our life that really we shouldn't have, and then we regret it? Yeah, could have avoided it if we didn't listen to all those people telling us that we're bad people for actually being human animals. Throwing it out there. I digress before I even begin. So getting back to this particular event, 31st of October 2001, as I said, Mark sees Bruce Mcarthur semi-regularly, passing him in the street, and he just does not like the feeling that he gives him. So Bruce Mcarthur would wave if Mark passed him. Now, Mark would always wave back. He was a pleasant guy, but he just got this really bad vibe from him. So if he saw him, he would purposefully cross the street. He didn't want to have those interactions and engagements, but Mcarthur didn't like that. So he would also cross the street. He'd ensure there was an interaction, which is a hell of a bit creepy, but nonetheless, some people are a little bit creepy. You do your best to avoid them. You're not necessarily thinking that there's anything violently destructive about them in their nature. You just might think they want to have some kind of connection with you, and you're going to do your best to avoid it. Now, that particular day, Mark's locking up his bicycle, and he'd returned home because he was going to collect a Halloween costume. So you can imagine where Mark is. He's probably excited. He's going on a night out. He's one of those men who's going to have made an effort. So everything feels good. Now, at this time, Mcarthur's on the street and he's paying for parking. So as usual, they go through the motions. He acknowledges Mark. But this is going to be a very different interaction. And it really speaks to the kind of engagement that Mcarthur has been trying to have with Mark. Obviously, he's aware that Mark is not wanting to engage with him. And it speaks volumes that, one, Mcarthur has ignored this, and two, he's consistently around when Mark is around. To me, there is a stalking vibe there. When we think about serial killers, you can think of some of those like BTK, who would literally stalk his victims for a long time. And there are many, many others who fit that paradigm. Michael Gargiulo, the Hollywood Ripper. These are individuals who, as part of their fantasy of killing, try to find people that fit a particular desirability. So I believe, without a doubt, that's what Mcarthur is doing, and that's why Mark keeps seeing him. I also believe that's why Mark has this dark, deep instinct about the malevolence of this character. He obviously is pleasant, acknowledges the guy's there, but just feels like there is some kind of coincidence of him being present in that area. Turns out, as Mark is going to the rear door of his building, Mcarthur kind of jogs after him. So as Mark unlocks the building's security door, Mark then notices that Mcarthur is behind him, and instinctively just holds the door open. I mean, that's a very common action, isn't it? When you're a pleasant human being, when you're offering somebody etiquette, he thinks, oh, Mcarthur must be going into the same building that I live in. So he holds it open for him. Then Mark ends up walking pretty much a very short distance from the building's entrance to his apartment. It's about 15 feet. Now, Mcarthur, all the while, is behind him, and he's struck up this conversation asking him, what you're doing for Halloween. And obviously Mark is thinking, this is kind of strange, but again, the guy's probably come to visit somebody in the building. So Mark's unlocking his apartment, and he was literally just about to answer Mcarthur and say, well, this is what I'm doing for Halloween, when all of a sudden he just feels an impact on the top of his head. It just comes from nowhere. And it literally is so powerful that it knocks him right through the apartment doorway. Now, at first, Mark has that classic, and this is such a classic reaction of a good person, his brain cannot compute that he has just been violently assaulted. So what his brain does is it gives him a logical and far more palatable reasoning as to why he's ended up feeling this impact. And he says to himself, well, maybe Mcarthur's fallen into me. Or he even thought, maybe the ceiling has collapsed on me. Now, you have so many thoughts in a second. It's just enormous. I mean, literally, we have thousands of things go on in our head in a second. So in that moment, milliseconds as they pass, these are the things that his brain is connecting with. Can't possibly be being attacked. It must be something like the ceiling falling in. Because he's been taken completely by surprise. This is so left field. So he's in this situation now in shock, and he turns round and suddenly is met with Mcarthur just holding a metal pipe over his head. And he said there was just an absolute look of complete fury on Mcarthur's face. And Mark realises in that instant, oh my God, this guy's going to kill me. He just knew it. All of that prior instinct culminating in this horrific moment. And then there's just that absolute recognition, the epiphany. This man's here to murder me. And Mcarthur at that point brings down the weapon towards his head a second time. Now Mark did, out of instinct and reaction, he raised his hands to protect himself defensively. Now the bar strikes his hand and he actually ends up breaking two of his fingers and he breaks his arm. So imagine the level of impact there. That's two broken fingers and a broken arm in one foul swoop. This killer is very, very violent, of course, but also he's powerfully strong. And then Mcarthur keeps striking him multiple times. This is on his body, on his head. And when Mcarthur actually looms over him, Mark, thank God, who's on the floor at this moment in time, dazed, confused, shocked, terrified, he manages to basically push him away with both his feet, and that hurls the attacker backwards. And I think if any of you remember when you were kids, you know, you would get your knees up to your chest, get your friend kind of lying on your knees and holding onto your hands, and you kind of flick them backwards. Was it just me who did that? My brother and I used to do that a great deal. It's amazing as well, let me tell you, how far a 4-year-old can go. I learned that when I was 8 and he was 4. My mother was constantly upset with the amount of injuries he and I gained, but I don't know. We had a lot of fun. But you know what I mean? Even as a young person, having that power of pushing your feet really does have an impact. And so Mcarthur isn't ready for this, but even though he gets hurled backwards, you have to remember that Mark has been really badly assaulted. So blood's pouring down his scalp, it's pouring into his eyes, and it would actually later transpire that his skull had been really seriously fractured by the blow. And mixed in that blood, it was not just blood, this is how bad the impact had been, there was cranial fluid seeping out as well. Now Mark at this point manages to just crawl further into his apartment, and first of all he's thinking to himself, do I just pick up a candlestick? Do I fight back? But at this moment in time, he genuinely couldn't hear right, he could hardly see. So all he can think about is alerting the authorities. So he grabs his phone and he manages to dial 911. Now, as he's doing this, Mcarthur literally comes up to him. This is a guy who has just all but killed this man. And he says to Mark, please don't tell them this happened. Please don't tell them this is me. So he's basically saying, yeah, I've just almost killed you brutally, but at the end of the day, don't tell the police on me. And there are two things that go through my head there. One, we can say, well, that's emotional immaturity and disassociation, because he isn't acknowledging the reality of what he's done. But for me, there was also quite a malice in that, because on one level you're saying, oh, this guy doesn't want to get into trouble by the police, but also there's a level of threat there. Don't tell them this happened. Please don't tell them it was me. So part of that could be, you know, if you do that, there's going to be an even more serious consequence. And for Mark to have to make a decision about what he's saying in that moment and what implications that has for him must have been truly terrifying. Now, the call handler actually asks Mark to describe what his attacker was wearing. So Mark is trying to relay all this information, and whilst he relays the information, Mcarthur's just desperately trying to pull the phone wire from the wall. Again, that's why I think that he would have been quite happy to finish the job. And it's the fact that Mark is clinging on to that phone. And if he didn't have a phone that had a really long wire, I know that some of you out there will be like, pardon? What the hell's a wire and a phone? Back in the day, when I was young, your phones would have this coiled wire. I'm really giving away my age now, aren't I? And it was quite incredible, because whilst the phone would be in one place, you'd be able to stretch the wire a considerable distance so that, you know, you could have a little bit of a chat with one of your mates, even though your parents were in a room in a corner across the other side. That kind of thing. But essentially that phone wire, because it was so long, it saved him, because whilst Mcarthur's trying to pull it from the wall, it just keeps kind of elongating. So he's unable to do that. Now, the next thing that poor Mark remembers is the police officer at his door. And the police officer at that moment in time obviously asks, is the attacker still in the apartment? But Mcarthur had already fled. And at this point, Mark is rushed to hospital. The fact that he flees, we could also say serial killers are known to hate people breaking their fantasy. They hate people acting in a way that they don't expect. Unpredictability is the enemy, particularly of the organised serial killer. They don't want that. They like people to act in a way that they have concocted in their mind. And when somebody refuses to do that, and Mark certainly refused to do that, it probably took away the impetus that he felt to continue with that crime anyway. At the same point, we can all agree he escaped very luckily with his life, and that's testament to Mark's survival mechanism. It really is. He obviously has quite a strong one. That's why he sniffed out the weirdness in Mcarthur before any of this happened. Now, Mark does recall one of the most heartbreaking parts of his journey being a victim was that no one took him seriously. The authorities genuinely didn't see this as a big deal, and I'll tell you why. First of all, when he's in the ambulance, he literally remembers the paramedics laughing and joking as he's lying there. Now, that is totally inappropriate. This guy is genuinely, desperately injured, and the paramedic's job is to provide compassion, understanding, empathy, and also to act in a way that makes the person who is the patient feel safe. If you're laughing and joking with each other and ignoring the patient, you alienate them, you isolate them, and you also make them feel that what's just happened, which in this context is a violent, all but murder. And that's what he's coping with in the aftermath immediately of this. It's disgusting. Shame on those paramedics. Shame on those paramedics. Now, once they arrive at the hospital, it doesn't get any better. So a police officer comes over and speaks to him. Now, bear in mind, despite the fact that this has been a wholly unprovoked attack, Mark has no relationship with Mcarthur at all. He's been attacked by a relative stranger. The officer feels that it's appropriate to ask him whether he's been having a sexual relationship with his attacker. So he's already at this moment in time assumed that the reason that Mark has ended up all but dead is because he's a gay sex worker. I kid you not, guys. This is the level of homophobia that's occurring in Toronto at this time. Just putting it down to, well, you're living one of those lifestyles, what can you expect? I don't know, officer. I'm going to throw it out there. I'd expect you to do your job, and I don't know, try to arrest people who are clear killers. Even if they haven't succeeded yet, mate, they're going to succeed if you ain't going to do nothing about it. Throw it out there, maybe take a statement and toddle off, take your handcuffs, do your job, sweetheart. That would be the best scenario right now, wouldn't it? To just call out that clear homophobia and make those police officers realise that they have a job to do, no matter what their beliefs and biases. But this is how the story begins, and it's how it kind of ends as far as Mark is concerned. Let me throw this out there. If you want to understand just how deplorable his treatment was, the police didn't even take a victim statement from him. You heard me. The police didn't even take a victim statement from him because they didn't see him as a victim. They saw him as somebody who had potentially invited this, both into his life, his home, and created his injuries because he's party to that relationship. How utterly disgraceful is that? It's really difficult to wrap your head around how an individual victim feels when they have all but been murdered and people are making them feel so helpless and so marginalized. You know, at the end of the day, Mark has to cope not only with his injuries, but within the neglect from the services and authorities that should have been there to protect him. Now, Mcarthur isn't stupid. He knows the way the world works. And believe me, you'll understand why, as we move through this crime, he has this understanding of how gay people are treated, because that's one of his weapons, essentially. So Mcarthur has obviously thought about, okay, how do I get out of this situation? Well, I can't run from the police because Mark knows who I am, so my name's going to be given in. So I need to manage this in a way that's going to give me the best outcome. So he hands himself into the police. Of course he does, because if he was truly guilty, if he truly intended to murder somebody, at the end of the day, he's not going to walk into a police station. He's not going to admit that he was present. He's going to try to deny it, but he knows he can't. So by managing this scenario in the way that he does, he's going to minimize the level of impact it has on his life. And he is so right. He makes out that, of course, he had met Mark and that meeting had been all about sex, plays into the bias and belief systems of the homophobic officers. So he ends up pleading guilty to possession of a deadly weapon, assault with a weapon, and assault causing bodily harm. Now, they're serious offences, I appreciate, but they're not attempted murder, are they? And the assumption there is that Mark was a willing party who had invited Mcarthur into his home, and therefore the consequences were half to do with him. And it's just absolute baloney. But nonetheless, this is going to cause a real change in the way that this crime is dealt with. Now, initially, the prosecution felt that a prison term was warranted. Really? Sorry. I do not know how to describe this without my head going. The prosecution initially felt that a prison sentence was warranted. Why is that then? Is it because this victim, who is just going about his business, trying to get his Halloween outfit, has been assaulted to a point where cranial fluid and blood is seeping out of his head, and he's been really badly injured by a guy that basically has no place in his life, no relationship with him, and also, even if, which they weren't, meeting for sex, would still mean this individual was in a position where they could have killed him. Warranted a prison sentence? Of course it warranted a prison sentence. Gonna put my judge's hat on now. It warranted a very long prison sentence with a very long license agreement after he was freed, if he was freed down the line. But who am I, with my logic and conscience and genuine understanding of the law, to suggest that a prison sentence would be an appropriate measure here? I don't know. I guess I'm just that individual with common sense. Anyway, this is how it goes. They get a psychologist report who concludes that the risk of reoffending was very minimal. Very minimal. Just gonna go through this in my head. Mcarthur beats somebody nearly to death, unprovoked attack. Guy's left horribly injured and traumatized. Psychologist speaks to Mcarthur, who no doubt minimizes. That's a real big red flag. You don't minimize, because that suggests that you don't have the conscience to change. Manipulates the psychologist, because psychologist clearly isn't any good and is very easy to be manipulated. And then finally manages to get that psychologist to write a report saying that basically he's not going to do any more harm, because why? I mean, how could you write that? If you've beaten somebody nearly to death, you can't say that they've got a minimal potential of reoffending, because past history predicts future behaviour. It's bizarre. Whoever that psychologist is should have been struck off, because I'm telling you now, there is nothing on God's earth that should have a psychologist even consider writing that in a report, because first of all, they ain't no psychic. So unless they can truly read the future, step away, take a step back, God, because that's who this person's playing. The narcissism in that actual suggestion is profound, and people like that should not be in the field. Personal and professional opinion. And certainly that report, the ramifications cause lives. So I hope to God that individual was pointed out as being profoundly incorrect in what they stated, and also profoundly outside the realms of their position. It's not your job to be a psychic. It's your job to deal with legitimate reality. There'll be some psychologist somewhere now going, oh my God, I can't believe that she hasn't suggested that we are capable of psychicity. Of course we are capable of psychicity. You know what I mean? Know your position. None of us can tell and predict the future. And as I said, in this case, it's disastrous. That conclusion isn't just proven wrong, it's proven disastrously incorrect. And as I said, I don't know on what planet anyone is allowed to write that kind of stuff in reports when we're dealing with such a heinous crime. On the strength of that report alone, he was ultimately sentenced to 1 year house arrest in 2003. That was it. House arrest for that violent, despicable crime, which without doubt intended to kill his victim. There is no doubt whatsoever that Mark would not have survived had it not been for his amazing ability to firstly not comply and to secondly fight, God damn it, for his life. Also, he does get banned from the gay village. He gets banned from spending time with male prostitutes for 2 years. That's right, guys, 2 years. I mean, 1 year house arrest and 1 year not allowed to go places where he could cause somebody horrific harm. What an incredibly powerful sentence. I imagine that there is no reason for him to offend in the future. After all, the consequences were so stern, weren't they? Now, during the sentencing hearing, there was literally no statement from his victim for the judge to consider, because he was never given an option to do a victim impact statement, because Mark wasn't really considered a victim, was he, by the homophobic police. So Mark was denied any chance to express himself. He was denied an opportunity to stand in court and say, this is what he did to my life. He devastated his life. He really did. During the actual hearing, Mcarthur, he did actually have the opportunity to address the Ontario Court Judge, William Basil. Now, this is what he said. I just want to apologise to the court for what happened. My life's been kind of a mess in the last year and a half. Knowing what's going to happen and what's happened to me, I'd like to apologise to the victim. I wouldn't know what to say other than, I'm sorry for all the pain and anger I've caused him. What? First of all, pain and anger. I get the pain because clearly he'd physically affected him, emotionally affected him. But anger, how does he know whether Mark's anger is there or not? Actually, for Mark, he was just in a devastated place of post-trauma. Anger is something that actually can be pretty constructive. Like, I can throw it at you, I can express it, I can constructively use it. You know, anger can sometimes be quite a therapeutic place to be as long as it's not directed in a way that is destructive. But I don't think Mark was at that space or place. I think he was devastated. And bear in mind, because of this relatively minor nature of the conviction, Mcarthur's details don't even get entered into the police database. I know, this is literally a tick box exercise into how to fail an investigation and future subsequent issues that arise from that, which can be directly attributed to this mess. So this doesn't happen. No details are in the police database. And this means that, obviously, Mcarthur's given basic free license, isn't he? He's not been given any real consequences. He's now probably feeling superior and to some degree able to carry on with whatever he wants to, because firstly, he's got no respect for the way the investigators actually deal with this situation. He knows he's outsmarted them. And secondly, he again has it reinforced that, hey, gay guys, is anyone going to take them seriously? And that's another armor that he carries, this belief that he's more untouchable because of the kind of victim that he's going to look for. Obviously, down the line, the authorities have massive regrets about not giving Mark's case the attention it deserved, and rightly bloody so, because it's cost many lives. And the blame, apart from with the individual perpetrator, who clearly the blame lies with, it also lies at the feet of the absolutely despicable attention that was given to Mark being a homosexual, as opposed to the attention given to him being a victim. They failed massively. And the rest of this story begins because of that failure. So following the attack, Mark's life, character, and everything changed. And he didn't even want to leave the house. In fact, he started doing things like his laundry at 4 a.m. because he wanted to avoid other people. And he said, I was running from him constantly. I was afraid that he was lurking in the darkness. In my imagination, he was behind every tree and in every bush. Imagine carrying that with you every moment of every day. And not only would Mark suffer the consequences of the police mishandling the case, their failure to identify Mcarthur as the dangerous predator that he so clearly was had deadly repercussions, because it's not long after this that gay men in the Toronto LGBTQ community just start to disappear. It's also very important to note that the only reason that Mark survived that attack was because at the time Mcarthur didn't actually know how to effectively kill someone, because it's suspected that Mark was genuinely Mcarthur's first actual victim. But because of this, he's just given license to reoffend. And so he starts to hone his skills during the years that follows. He's figured out how not to get away with a crime, so he's going to make damn sure that the next time he offends, he leaves far less possibility to be discovered. And we all know that the most challenging thing for a perpetrator is a witness. So if you realize that a witness can cause you a lot of trouble, then it's far better to ensure that you don't leave any witnesses alive. Mcarthur also has this, I suppose, new opportunity because of the World Wide Web. Realistically, many young people have grown up just always having it. But I grew up without the web. I can remember starting to get emails after registering for my first email. It was a big deal. But for a lot of people, particularly those, for example, under 30, it's just been part and process of your lives. But if you're an older person or middle-aged person, then you kind of grew up seeing these new opportunities. Dating is a great example of that, right? Tinder did not exist, Grindr did not exist. These are all new phenomena. And it makes connection pretty simple, but it also means that if you are a predator, it means procuring victims becomes more easy. Particularly if you have a typical MO for the type of victim that you want, it's absolutely simple to find people who meet those descriptors. And Mcarthur starts using this technology to hunt his victims. So he uses dating sites and hookup apps. There's one called Silver Daddies, and that was a website where his username was SilverFox51. Now, in that particular profile, he described himself as a leather daddy. So this is kind of indicative of saying, I'm a dominant. I want to be with guys who like to be submissive. And also he noted that he liked to take guys further than they'd usually go. That is a massive red flag. If somebody is legitimately willing to expose themselves and their behavior in that way on any kind of digital platform, it's because firstly, they don't necessarily see that pushing somebody's personal boundaries to a place that isn't comfortable is firstly not legal. Consent underpins everything. Even if you're a submissive guy who likes a particular type of behavior that's given towards them during sexual experiences, having a boundary like a safe word is paramount. If you use that safe word and then somebody's like, I'm going to ignore that and push you further, that's non-consensual. So Mcarthur's happy to advertise that. So he has no respect for personal boundaries in any way, shape or form, but he's also advertising that he's going to do something terrible, isn't it? He's actually putting it out there. Oh, you won't be comfortable with this and I'm not going to care. Now, I agree that absolutely not one of those individuals who answered that particular ask out there to be a submissive for him could have potentially or possibly predicted in any way, shape or form that this man didn't mean he was going to take them further than they usually went. He was actually advertising that he was going to kill them. Without a doubt, there's a double meaning in what he's saying there, because you can't take anybody further than death, can you? But these guys aren't turning up with thinking that that could be a possibility. They're probably just thinking he's pretty kinky, maybe he's going to push them a little bit farther, and as a submissive, part of that will be quite tantalising because at the end of the day, you want to be dominated. So we get to 2010 and Skandaraj Navaratnam just disappears. He's actually known as Skandar. And Skandar is a refugee from Sri Lanka. He'd moved to Canada in the 1990s. He was a really happy, social and outgoing individual, also incredibly academic, very educated, was known to have a very curious mind. And apparently some people who knew him said that he was absolutely unbeatable at Scrabble. Honestly, I still to this day am one of those people that cannot connect with Scrabble. My brain is not clever enough, but he's apparently just absolutely genius level of it. He gets reported missing on the 16th of September 2010, and the reason for that is that friends, they found that his puppy was alone and he'd been unfed in his actual apartment. Now, Skandar had last been seen leaving the Zippers gay bar in Toronto 10 days earlier. And according to his friends, Skandar was employed by Mcarthur and was also at the time in a sexual relationship with him. So clearly investigators are going to want to know what their relationship was like. And he's just disappeared off the face of the earth. So we get to November 2012 and the Toronto police actually launched Project Houston. And this is to actually investigate Skandaraj's disappearance because his friends know that he would never have gone of his own volition and left his puppy. So they have grave feelings about why he's suddenly nowhere to be seen. Now, during that investigation, the police are able to establish there are another 2 men missing. That's 44-year-old Bazir. He's actually called Abdul Bazir Faizi. And also 58-year-old Majid Kayem. He's actually known as Hamid. Now, Bazir was an immigrant from Afghanistan. He was married and he had children, but he did secretly use gay dating apps for older men as well. And we understand that it's very well to suggest that we live in an accepting society and that homosexuality is now something we just fully accept, but it's just not true even today. And certainly particular cultures and belief systems find being gay something so dishonorable that if they were to discover that you were living a gay lifestyle, you would be completely disowned. And that's a very heavy burden to carry for anybody. And clearly we see men throughout ages, including today, getting married and actually having double lives because they can't openly be who they are for fear of being rejected. So he's living this secret life. He had a decent job. He worked as a machine operator at a printing company. And then he just disappears. He leaves the workplace. It's around 7 p.m. on 28th of December 2010. Just never gets home. His home's in Brampton and he just disappears into thin air. Now, on the night that he goes missing, he goes and visits a burger bar in Toronto's gay village, and he also went to a gay sauna. Gay sauna, for those of you who don't know what it is, it's not just a place where you go to sit in a steam room. It's usually somewhere where people have consensual sex, sometimes group sex. So he goes there and spends some time. Bear in mind his wife, who of course is a victim in this, she's got no idea of the secret life that he's living. And because, as far as she is concerned, there are no ties to the gay village and people aren't talking about the fact that he has ties there, that means that the connection to some degree is unknown. So his disappearance is basically not even noticed really by Toronto's LGBT community. And as I said, because she's unaware of it, she's not kind of linking it either. And then we have another guy, Majid Kayan. Now, like Bazir, he's also an immigrant from Afghanistan. So you can see the pattern that's forming now, can't you? Now, he had disappeared on the 14th of October 2012. And his family, again, had been completely unaware he was gay. So he would frequent the bars in the gay village. And then after the marriage to his wife broke down, he actually moved near the Church Street area of Toronto. And that's quite close to the gay village. But he was a good dad. He still kept in close contact with his kids. And it ends up that he gets reported missing by his adult son. That's on the 25th of October 2012. So it is being noted that these men have disappeared, but the links are a little more problematic because they're not obviously and overtly involved in the gay village, and therefore when they're looking at the kind of people who are going missing, it's not necessarily packaged in that, oh, we're looking for a man who's targeting gay men. And in particular, gay immigrants who have come to the country, hopefully for a better life, only to have their lives stolen from them by this predator. Now, all three of those guys had gone missing from the same small area in Toronto. This is clearly something that needs to be married up. There is finally what I would say a break in the police investigation, and that police investigation receives an anonymous tip. Sometimes I wonder who really solves crime. I do, because a lot of crimes get solved because somebody just tells an individual, this person needs to be looked at, or I know this person did A, B, or C, or I'm the witness, as opposed to great and deep investigations. So there's this anonymous tip that links Mcarthur to Skanda and Margie's disappearances. So understandably, they bring Mcarthur in. That's what you're going to do. You've got somebody who's being pointed to as the perpetrator. Now, in relation to Skanda's disappearance, even though they were literally connected and having a sexual relationship, he's basically considered more of a witness than a suspect. Apparently, because they've been close friends for a long time, they couldn't possibly be in a scenario where Mcarthur had actually killed him. I mean, when does that happen? When does it happen that you're murdered by somebody you know? I mean, that's statistically unusual, isn't it? It isn't like pretty much 70% of all murders are committed by somebody you know when you're the victim. No, that couldn't possibly be an absolute reality, could it? But anyway, no, they knew each other. He employed him, they were having sex. Couldn't possibly be the killer. I kid you not, guys. They literally, genuinely didn't think that he was a suspect. Also, Mcarthur actually claimed that he had indeed also employed Majid at one point, and he also had consensual sexual relations with him for a brief period. He said he also regularly interacted with Skanda at gay bars. And when they link all of this together and like, oh, hang on a minute, there seems to be one main link here. One main link. This guy is either employing them and having sex with them at the same time and going around with them in the gay vicinity where they're interacting with each other. And all of those have that common theme and thread with Mcarthur. And now they've just disappeared. Who could be the suspect in this? Who could be the prime candidate, having had access to all of them, both sexually and on an employment level, and then they just disappear? Who could possibly be the perpetrator? I'll tell you who it isn't. Go on, who isn't it? It isn't Mcarthur. What? Yeah, it's not Mcarthur. Why? Well, he admitted to having sex with them and employing them, so he's definitely not a suspect. I think that you probably need to go and work, I don't know, with something like I Scream, where you can't do any damage to society or investigations. Whilst you're there, I'll have a 99. Thanks very much. With some sprinkles on as well, kid. Thank you. I kid you not. Dismissed as a suspect. And ironically, had the police actually dealt with Mark's case a decade earlier, they're going to have viewed this Mcarthur completely differently, aren't they? He'd been convicted of a really serious attack on Mark, but of course he was never going to offend again because that psychologist was so brilliant, weren't they? Never going to offend again, not a problem. But if he had been taken seriously as the perpetrator then, those details would have been on the system and it would have raised a red flag. He'd have been investigated more thoroughly and hopefully they would have linked him in relation to the disappearances. Now it gets worse, and I should not be able to say those words. Why are those words falling from my lips? But it does. It gets worse, guys. Because in 2014, the arrogant, superior, narcissistic Mcarthur, who now feels that he can control the world because, hey, he can just admit to knowing these people, having sex with these people, and he's figured out that that's a perfect alibi. So he is really feeling confident now. And the police grant him a record suspension. Now, if you don't know what one of those means, just imagine somebody being involved in a really violent 2001 attack, shall we take it? Attack on Mark, shall we look at that one? Yeah, they expunged that actual conviction from his record. They just eradicated it. Now for Mark, that means it didn't really happen. Can you imagine that as a victim? They just make it so that Mcarthur has a clean record. In background checks, it would never appear. That's just so offensive beyond belief. Now, ultimately, Project Houston was closed after 18 months. Yeah, these guys have just disappeared. It links to one guy. We don't believe that he's the actual individual capable of this. Let's just close the case. So in April 2014, it's over essentially. Fails to determine a reason for the men's disappearance. Really? That's because, I don't know, you didn't look. Also failed to link the disappearances. And yet, there is one thing that does remain consistent. Men just continue to vanish. So we get to August 2015. Can you believe I am talking about something in such modern time? We're talking about gay men going missing in 2015 and still people are not realising we have a serial killer on the loose. So we have 50-year-old Sarush Mahmoodi and he's from Scarborough, disappears into thin air. Now, like some of the other men, he was living a secret life. He had been in relationships with women, but was also in a scenario where he was actually having relationships with men. He wasn't actually known to be part of Toronto's gay scene, so his wife ends up reporting him missing. Again, the link is missed, so to speak. Now in 2016, Mcarthur, and for any of you out there now who are having a Christmas sherry or a gin and tonic, you may want to pour yourself another one because I think the rage is about to bubble. Mcarthur gets interviewed by the police after he tries to strangle a friend. Yeah, in his van. I use the word strangle a friend loosely because personally, I don't know, just throwing it out there on the list of attributes and variables and particular issues that we'd expect from friends, strangling you isn't necessarily one of them. Usually murderers do that, don't they? Also, that van in which he tried to strangle his friend was lined with plastic. Straight out of a horror movie, except for horribly real. So he asked his friend to lie on top of a fur coat and then he starts to strangle him. Now, we can all agree, people have kinks. If you are a submissive, you enjoy being dominated, and you were in what you consider a consensual relationship, you will do whatever is going to turn you on in that moment because there is a trust level. You believe that this person is somebody who is not going to do you any harm. So he obviously goes ahead and does it. Either they've done this before, or this is something that he's done in previous experiences and interactions sexually, and he doesn't think that he's going to get harmed in any way. But then the attack begins. And this friend of Mcarthur says that what he really noted was this just look of anger on Mcarthur's face. And later down the line, Mcarthur, when he's being investigated for this, he says to the police, oh yeah, I did put my hands around my friend's throat for a few seconds, but he was really enjoying it. He was getting off on it. He thought he liked it rough. And then he says, and actually at that point, when I'm thinking he's liking it, my friend grabs me by the throat and starts to strangle me. And apparently only when Mcarthur had put his hands up in surrender did this friend stop strangling him. And Mcarthur also says, look, we've had sex numerous times in the past. We've never had a problem. And the police are like, okay, that sounds really fair. That literally happened. I genuinely think the police officer did that. Mcarthur has got it to a T, hasn't he? He knows that there is bias and prejudice built in around the sexual lives of gay men. Therefore, he just concedes that yes, he is there. He did do A, B, or C, but there was no intention. It's just these guys interpreting the situation differently. Just imagine the kind of person you have to be in a scenario with someone that then consensually strangles you, resulting in you going to the police. And that doesn't happen. You'd have to be a real strange individual to do that. And no doubt there'd be lots of other warning signs about your character where the authorities are concerned, because people who complain falsely are very rare. But that's how they see him. They see this gay guy who's all but been throttled, who's felt so upset and worried and scared by Mcarthur, who's felt like this guy has serious potential and intent, and he's taken the courage to speak to the authorities, and the authorities have just ignored him. Mcarthur, you know, at least he's honest about what they get up to. And that unashamed and unapologetic mindset that Mcarthur has plays into the way that these police officers want to deal with these situations. Oh, it's just another gay guy, and what can you expect? He puts himself in these situations. So Mcarthur has got the manipulation down to an absolute T. He can outsmart these fools, and he knows it. So this guy, as ever, is getting no consequences at all. He's just been released yet again. The police believe him over any of his victims. We've seen it before, we're seeing it again. Then we get to the following year, so it's the 14th of April 2017. 44-year-old Salim Essam, he disappears. Now, Salim had been a native of Turkey, and he'd actually come to Canada in 2013. And he would often be seen wheeling a small plastic suitcase around the gay village area and Kensington Market. Now, many people believed that he was of no fixed abode, so he didn't have an address, but actually others said that's not true. He was just in a bad relationship, so he didn't have the consistency within his housing. Salim was described as a really kind, friendly, kind-hearted man. He had struggled with substance abuse in the past, so there'd obviously been some issues for him that made his experience more difficult and problematic. And it also makes him more vulnerable, without a doubt. Now, he had last been seen on the 14th of April 2017. He was seen at his home near the village, and it was actually his friend who reported him missing, because he used to speak to his friend every single day, so he knew that something bad had happened. Then we have 2 months after that, just a little over in fact, another man disappears from the same area. This is the day after Pride. This time it's 49-year-old Andrew Kinsman. Now, he was described as a real lovely man who just cared deeply about his family, cared deeply about other people, but also he was a gay rights activist. He was a big champion of social justice issues. He was somebody that was seen as profoundly important in raising the bar of expectation that the gay community deserved. He was fighting for justice. He was fighting to have the gay community respected and validated and protected in the way that they deserved. Now, when he was last seen, he'd been in really good spirits. And it's important to note that, because obviously people can say, well, if somebody disappears, they might have taken their own life, you've just not found a body, what kind of character were they, how were they feeling before they disappeared? But this guy was in a really good place. His disappearance is totally unexplained, and friends were so concerned about him that they called it his flat. Didn't see any signs of a struggle. There's nothing that had been disturbed. However, there was one real big red flag. His 17-year-old cat hadn't been fed, and they knew there was absolutely no way on God's earth that Andrew would have willingly left his pet this way. They knew. nothing would have prevented him from protecting his loved animal. Now, Andrew was last seen on the 26th of June 2017, and he was seen at his home on Winchester Street, Cabbagetown. Now, unlike all of the previous people that I've discussed, the disappearance of Andrew really provoked something within the community. It really did. He was well known in the gay community, and his friends were absolutely horrified at his disappearance, and they started a really high profile search for him. They put posters up all over the area, all over the surrounding neighborhoods. They had Facebook groups that were set up. They wanted people to share information. And when the police searched Andrew's apartment, they did finally, just going to throw it out there, they did finally actually discover a vital clue. On a calendar written on the day that he actually disappeared was one word: Bruce. So now they're starting to tie things together. So the police launched Project Prism. This was to actually investigate Andrew and Salim's disappearances. So they start studying CCTV footage. This is from outside Andrew's apartment. And on the day of his disappearance, it had captured him walking towards a red 2004 Dodge Caravan. Now, investigators then obviously look at how common this car is. There were 6,000 similar vehicles in Toronto. Only 5 were registered to a Bruce. And crucially, only 1 was a 2004 model. Registered owner, Bruce Mcarthur. So at this point, he becomes the prime suspect. He'd actually got rid of that vehicle at that point, by the way, because he was obviously predicting that he could, shall we say, get identified as a potential suspect. Because bear in mind, the disappearance of this man has blown up. So he's been warned to some degree that they're not going to let it lie. But in spite of the fact that he's got rid of it, investigators do manage to trace it, and then they start with the forensic analysis. And very quickly, they find Andrew's blood inside it. Furthermore, they find the DNA of missing 44-year-old Salim Essen as well. So this is bang to rights, Bruce. Bang to rights. And what joy I have being able to say that. Now, the police were subsequently able to obtain a warrant, and they secretly entered Mcarthur's apartment in December 2017, gathering evidence. Whilst they were in there, they managed to clone half of a computer hard drive, and later they forensically analysed the content, and my God, heart-stoppingly, heartbreakingly, terrifyingly dreadful. The images on that hard drive instantly had authorities realising that they were dealing with a serial killer. So the partial download of Mcarthur's deleted files, they revealed post-mortem images of both Salim and Andrew. Now, the pictures of Salim, they showed him dead in Mcarthur's bed, and there were also 18 pictures of Andrew dead in Mcarthur's van. It's just so distressing to imagine Andrew just walking towards that van that day, having no idea whatsoever that he was literally walking to his doom. Investigators were able to later find hundreds more photos. That was of Mcarthur's victims, and those victims had pictures taken of them before they were killed and then after they died. And some of the images actually showed how he'd killed them, so they still had ligatures around the necks. Others were posed, they were in fur coats, they would be positioned and suggestively posed. One of the victims had his eyes taped open, and others had unlit cigars that were draped, hanging from their lips. He also would shave the hair and the beards of some of the victims, and he would actually take that hair and keep it in Ziploc bags in the shed. I mean, that's just keeping those mementos, isn't it? It's the scent of the individual that he murdered. It's connecting him and anchoring him psychologically to the crime so that he can reconnect with it, he can relive it. That he'd even gone as far as keeping separate computer folders for each victim. Some of them were labelled with names, some of them were labelled with just numbers. But again, the arrogance, and also this is the bit that, again, I talk about within Mother Nature. When we're created, I think that she leaves chinks in our armor. And without a doubt, imagine the narcissism that this man has, the superiority, but it plays into his stupidity. Because like so many serial killers, he can't help but want to actually keep hold of certain things linking him to the crime. And also, he wants to be able to actually look at those individuals that he's murdered. So he's kept all of this information about them, which essentially means that he's guilty as hell. That chink in the armor, his arrogance and narcissism leads to him being very forensically unsophisticated. You do not keep things that connect you directly with killings. Now, they did also find pictures of men that were still alive. So he didn't kill all of them. This includes Sean Cribben. So he met Mcarthur on like a hookup website and they did arrange to meet for sex. Sean had also agreed with Mcarthur that he could push his limits, but Mcarthur just went far too far. He gave him GHB and then he cut off his airway so he couldn't breathe. So he sat on his chest and he strangled him until he passed out. And then he awoke to horror, I guess, finding Mcarthur standing over him. But he said that even though like he was in a really terrifying situation and he couldn't account for at least 20 minutes, he did actually get away. He got out and lived. It wasn't as if Mcarthur decided that he was definitely going to kill him. He let him walk away. So it seems like Mcarthur got enough from that interaction. There must have been something psychologically satisfying enough about the encounter that he had, that he essentially let him live, if that makes sense. But 20 minutes just disappeared. Anybody who's been spiked with this particular drug will know that's what happens. You might have some flashes, but you lose time. Now, what happened, which Sean was unaware of, is that he was completely out for a period of time because there were pictures found on Mcarthur's computer. And it's clear that the picture was taken when he was unconscious. And on it, Mcarthur had actually put a hood over Sean's head. He'd covered his eyes with duct tape and he'd held a metal pipe against his throat. At the time, obviously Sean had no idea how lucky he'd been to escape with his life. But it's almost as if Mcarthur satisfied his fantasy because he managed to get the poses of Sean essentially looking dead, and then it meant that when he came round, he was allowed to walk away. Also, the police started to realise that GHB was often a part of Mcarthur's MO. So this was something that he used effectively to make it difficult for his victims, because obviously when you're unconscious, there's nothing you can do about it, you can't fight back, and so on and so forth. Now, another man, this guy wished to remain anonymous, which I totally understand. He'd once gone to Mcarthur's, taken the drug, and then he decided to leave because Mcarthur had started to ask him some really odd and disconcerting questions. So he asked him, are you close to your family? Do you have any siblings? I mean, it's like a serial killer interview, isn't it? So, do you have a family? Yeah? Yeah, I do. Are you close to that family? Yeah, I'm really close to my family. Do you have friends that care about you? I do have friends that care about me. I'm feeling a little bit awkward about this conversation. Why are you asking me these questions? I just like to build intimacy with victims, people, friends. I just like to ask questions to figure out a pen portrait of the family dynamics. Now back to the questioning. If you were to disappear, would anybody notice? I'm leaving now. I'm leaving right now. I'm leaving now. That is certainly something that everyone should see as a big red flag. On hindsight level, he realizes that this guy was just trying to see whether he'd be missed. So during the investigation, the police are looking into Mcarthur's background, of course. And let's just spend some time looking at this heinous human predator and who created him, where he came from, and whether we can look at some of the ingredient potential that created this predator. So he was born on the 8th of October 1951 and he grew up on a farm. So this was in a small rural town of Woodville, Ontario. Had one sister although his parents did actually foster a lot of other kids. And I think that's something that's really commendable. It genuinely is. However, my husband, his parents fostered children regularly and adopted, and it did at times mean that he felt quite alienated and isolated, and that his needs weren't necessarily at a priority level compared to the foster children who were much younger than him. And therefore, we have to also acknowledge that sometimes, no matter how brilliant it is that these human beings exist who foster children, it can impact on the biological children. Not saying for 1 minute it isn't a wonderful thing, it genuinely is. But for Mcarthur, it could mean that he felt a little bit pushed out, maybe not good enough, as in, well, why do my parents need other children, and so on and so forth. When he was at school, he didn't actually get into trouble, but he was considered a snitch. He was that kid who liked to tell on other children. That's not a way to enamor yourself towards other kids. But sometimes it can mean that you forge relationships with teachers. Tattletaling is something that's very common, and if it helps you build an alliance with teachers who maybe like to tell kids off, that could work. But usually it's a misstep in childhood. If you are telling tales on people that you want to build relationships with, then it's gonna create a level of distance between you. Unless, of course, you don't really care about relationships and you prefer having the power dynamic over them, i.e., you know that you can do something that will cause them pain and you go out of your way to do it. So certainly it could be a mindset of malevolence that's developing at this age, controlling his environment and harming people within that environment by doing so. I will note that growing up in a small rural area, it's going to be difficult being gay. It was in a strictly conservative rural area, and he had two very religious parents, and he's already potentially dealing with the fact that his parents spend a lot more time with the foster kids, and he's probably feeling a little bit alienated. And to add to that, his sexuality issues, we understand it would be challenging because he was born at a time that essentially was a far cry from the 1960s free love revolution. And that was only the very beginning of LGBTQ being accepted. It had been very challenging for people from backgrounds like his. So this basically leads to Mcarthur really struggling with his sexuality. And in an attempt to do what so many young men try to do, he tried to conform. So he marries his high school girlfriend, Janice Campbell, and he actually went on to have 2 children with her. And then in the early 1990s, he starts working as a traveling salesman. And it's towards the end of that decade, so the end of the 1990s, he comes out as gay. So we're in a more accepting zone, not perfect, but certainly more accepting. People are understanding that so many people have been suppressed and oppressed in their sexuality that he needed to get to a point, in spite of the fact that it would hurt his children and his wife, to actually live more authentically. However, bear in mind, probably a lot of resentment and rage, both towards society, but also towards gay men, because he probably doesn't like that part of himself. He probably has been struggling with it, and he looks at those men and thinks, you're my temptation. Why can't I just be straight? And this is something that lots of people wrangle with, and many internalize it and harm themselves, as opposed to understanding they have a right to make peace with it. And it's not their problem when other people don't accept. It's the people who don't accept's problem. But you can imagine the confusion, and we have to allow him the acknowledgement and acceptance. It would have been difficult. So this whole premise is he comes out as gay, he moves to Toronto, and he begins a new life. Sets up a landscaping business called Artistic Design. And also, during the Christmas holiday season, I can't believe I'm going to say this, he even worked as a mall Santa. I kid you not. I wonder whether him and John Wayne Gacy would have got on. They could have swapped, I don't know, dressing up skills, couldn't they? Given each other a few tips. Also, it's worth noting though, as a Santa, he was physically pretty appropriate. He had a big white beard, white hair, big belly. Also apparently had a jovial nature. I'm not sure I agree with that, but this is what I have been told about him through the research. Jovial nature, ho ho ho, and all that. However, authorities suspect, shall we say, that his extracurricular activities were far from jolly. Sorry, I couldn't help but bring in that word. It's very Christmas orientated. Yeah, the authorities just felt that this was a mask, this amiable exterior, this jolly nature. It was just a mask for this dark malevolence. Also within the gay community, he'd actually developed a reputation for BDSM and rough sex, which we can all agree is totally okay. Everybody has kinks. Some people are more vanilla, some people are not. And the reality is, as long as you're not harming anyone else, it's fine. And also, as long as your boundaries are respected, that's a really important part of BDSM and rough sex. Now, authorities decide that the best way of handling this situation is to place Mcarthur under 24-hour surveillance. Of course it is, because they're really concerned that at any moment he could strike again. And they finally intervene on the 18th of January 2018. And this is because they see a young man entering his apartment. And the fear is he could kill this guy. So they just swoop in. The officers get into the apartment and it's unbelievable. True to form and confirming the absolute clear fears of the authorities and the officers who go and investigate, they find the young man handcuffed to the bed. He's got a black bag on his head, but there is an addition to this. There's no eye holes. There's no breathing holes in the bag. And when the man had actually tried to remove it, which you can imagine you tried to do straight away, the survival mechanism, my God, I can't breathe. Mcarthur had attempted to tape his mouth shut. So the police really did save this guy's life. The police at this moment, when this is happening, arrive, and just like several of Mcarthur's other victims, they instantly know this guy's Middle Eastern. He's married, and his family had absolutely no idea he was gay. So this guy had actually connected with Mcarthur on a gay dating app and had secretly met for sex on several occasions. So this is what he does, isn't it? He builds up this relationship. Nothing's going to go wrong. I'm safe. I might push your limits a little bit, but it'll be okay. But all this time, he's just building to the kill, isn't he? He's luring them in, making them feel safe, reducing their anxieties, increasing their willingness to comply, and then bang, when he's ready, he kills them. Now, on Mcarthur's computer, there was actually a folder labelled with this victim's name. Yeah. It's unbelievable, isn't it? How terrifying. This guy has no idea. He's just his future victim. And during a subsequent search of Mcarthur's address, police were able to seize multiple USB flash drives, computers, digital cameras, and they also found rope and duct tape. Now, like I said, kinks are okay, but let me tell you, if anyone brings any duct tape out anywhere near you, run for the hills. I don't care if it's your best friend or your boyfriend. I don't care. Run. It really isn't worth being around anyone with duct tape, I don't know, unless they're fixing your toilet. So Mcarthur at this point, understandably, is arrested. Initially, he is charged with first-degree murders of Andrew Kinsman and Salim Essen. Now, Salim's notebook had actually been found during the search of Mcarthur's apartment. So again, we've got another connection with this man who's gone missing. Now, although the police are absolutely convinced that they've got the man, there is a problem. And the problem is they haven't got any bodies. But what they do know is that Mcarthur works as a landscaper. So investigators realise this guy could have a few graves, couldn't he? Could very easily cover up the killings by burying and disposing of these bodies where he worked. So they start horrifyingly to search the gardens of his customers. Can you imagine that? Knock at the door. Hello? Hello, we need to search your garden. Why? We just need to look for some bodies. This is ridiculous. It's my garden. I pay for a very expensive landscaper. It's looking beautiful. Look at my petunias. Look at my evergreens. My garden is a veritable feast of beauty. Why on earth would there be bodies? Oh, hang on. It's that weird Father Christmas looking guy. Did seem to have some unusual bags. Oh my God. That kind of thing. That would be the thing that would happen. But this is genuinely what occurs. So they go to his customers and they tell them that They believe he's behind the disappearance of men. And they also, at this point, believe that he could be behind the disappearance of a lot more men. And there's one place that the investigators are particularly interested in regarding where he works, because he had this deal with elderly residents at one of these particular properties in Mallory Crescent, Leaside, Toronto. And the deal was this: in return for letting him store his landscaping equipment there, he would basically look after the lawns. Now, at this property, cadaver dogs instantly picked up on something inside a large planter box. This is on the 19th of January 2018. 12 planters were subsequently removed for forensic evidence. In 2 of them, investigators found the dismembered skeletal remains of 3 men. Andrew was identified through fingerprint evidence, and the other identities of Skandar and missing 50-year-old Surush Mahmoodi, they were confirmed through dental records. What a horrifying discovery. It's unbelievable, isn't it? Now, following the further investigation of the planters, the remains of another 4 men were discovered. Unbelievable. Imagine the horror of those residents. There they are, thinking they've got some kind of good deal going with this guy who's looking after the lawns for free just for storing the equipment. But really, it's just a huge graveyard. We get to the 29th of January 2018. Police obviously have loads of evidence, way more sufficient than is required to charge Mcarthur with the first-degree murders of 3 more men as well. So that's 58-year-old Majid Kayan. Basically transpires that he briefly was hired by Mcarthur to assist with the landscaping work, and the 2 did actually have a brief sexual relationship. The authorities believe that that particular victim was killed around the 18th of October 2012. Now, unlike Mcarthur's other victims, Majid's remains were not actually found in the flower planters. They were found in a ravine behind the Leaside property where the planters had actually been discovered. Just discarded. Unbelievable. We're talking about life here. This man has got no value whatsoever for these individuals that he's murdered. Then we have Surush Mahmoodi. So during the investigation with his death, the authorities found a coat with his DNA on it in Mcarthur's van. They believe he was killed in August 2015. So again, they're piecing these things together, and it's just showing what a profoundly grotesque individual Mcarthur is, but also what a prolific serial killer he is. Then they find 43-year-old Dean Liswick. Now, Dean was homeless, so there's a high level of vulnerability there. He was living in shelters, he had issues with dependency, he had mental health issues, and he was also working as a sex worker, no doubt, to help fund these issues. And I think what's really tragic about this particular man, Dean, and the reason that it's so important to talk about people like Dean, is that he hadn't even been reported missing. No one had noticed him. The idea that somebody who was once a baby, who grew into a child, who should have been just valued and loved and unconditionally accepted in spite of his problems, no one even noticed. He'd disappeared. It's just horrific that you can only be noticed when you have your remains found. It's just tragic. Our society needs to do better, doesn't it? It's believed that he was murdered in April 2016, and that was actually the day that he was discharged from the homeless shelter. So you can imagine how vulnerable he was there. Probably just looking for somebody who could look after him, give him some money. Yeah, he'd have sex with that person, but it was just about serving a cause of giving him somewhere warm to sleep. Now, they believe that he was Mcarthur's 6th victim because they found some of his jewellery in Mcarthur's apartment as well, so they knew that he was definitely the person who killed him. Then we get to the 23rd of February 2018, and Mcarthur's then charged with the murder of 40-year-old Skandaraj Navaratnam, and he's believed to have been Mcarthur's first murder victim. Meanwhile, investigators had actually discovered an image of somebody they didn't know. So there's an unknown man in these pictures, and I will give it to the investigators. They really had tried to find out who this person was. They did want to know who this individual was that they realised had been killed by him. But they'd exhausted literally every single avenue and they just hadn't had any luck identifying him. So they took a pretty controversial, unusual step, but nonetheless one with the best intentions within it. They released an image to the public because they hoped that in doing so somebody would be able to identify him. So obviously they first of all photoshopped it because they wanted to make the image that they had of him very much less disturbing. And it showed a man with dark skin, black hair and a beard, and he was wearing a grey top. Eyes were slightly open, lips were slightly apart. And it didn't take long at all, actually, after they released that image for somebody to come forward and identify him as 37-year-old Krishna Kumar Kangaratnam. And he'd actually immigrated to Canada from Sri Lanka in 2010. And just like Sarush, he actually lived in Scarborough. Now, it's really sad because this guy's claim for asylum had been rejected. So, of course, that meant that he was actively avoiding authorities, and that played directly into Mcarthur's hands because, of course, if authorities don't know you exist, or if they're not looking for you in the context of thinking you've disappeared because you actually want to disappear, they're not going to pay attention to it. He had actually been ordered to be deported because he had no family in Canada. And again, he'd never been reported missing. And his family had actually feared that if they told the authorities, we've not heard from him, they'd have actually got him into trouble. So it was a double whammy. He had no roots in Canada. He had no family there. So nobody could speak to the authorities. And then the family that he did have, who obviously were very worried about him, didn't feel that they could tell Canadian authorities because he might get into trouble. They just presumed and hoped that he was in hiding. Little did they realise he'd been brutally murdered. Now, they believe that he was killed in January 2016, and they believe that he was Mcarthur's 7th victim. So Mcarthur gets charged with his murder in April 2018. Then on the 11th of April 2018, Mcarthur gets charged with the murder of 44-year-old Abdul Bazir Faizi, after his remains are also identified in the planter. Now, his car had been found abandoned during the investigation. So again, it just shows you that this is crazy. Obviously, somebody has come to great harm if they can't even find the person and the car's just been abandoned. And it's near the Leaside property where Mcarthur had stored his landscaping tools. So again, there's that connection. And of course, that's also where his remains had been found in planters. But it feels like there was just so many missed opportunities in connecting Mcarthur with these disappearances. Now, obviously, the police arrest him, is placed inside awaiting trial. And during this period of time, Mcarthur is held in segregation at the Toronto South Detention Centre. He was kept on continuous suicide watch because obviously they thought that potentially, when you think about a lot of serial killers and the way that they act when they're caught, often they'll try to remove themselves from this world to avoid being punished. So they keep watching him. And as the investigation progresses, the authorities just build this picture of what can only be described as a ruthless serial killer. And one that had somehow, despite glaringly obvious connections, one could say, passed under the radar. I mean, who'd have thought that? Who would have thought that a man who is basically connected to all these individuals on the whole that had disappeared could possibly be a serial killer? I don't know. It's almost impossible to conceive that anyone could have ever connected these cases. So when it came down to his MO, the investigators believed that, first of all, he'd incapacitate his victims, usually using something like GHB or a similar drug that would incapacitate them that way. And then he'd use a ligature to strangle them. But what he'd do is he'd tighten it by twisting with an iron bar. And then after he'd completely incapacitated, then murdered those victims, he'd pose their bodies and he'd take pictures of them. Obviously, we know that would be so he could relive the crimes later. Also, he would indulge in sex acts with their bodies after he'd murdered them, and once he'd finished with them, he'd dismember their bodies and then bury most of their parts at the property where he kept the tools. So he had, I suppose, a perfect conveyor belt of murdering and disposing of these bodies. He created the perfect ruse. He was a landscape gardener, nothing to see here. Now, later in court, Mcarthur pleaded guilty to all 8 counts of first-degree murder. I do appreciate that he did that. I think that saves a lot of money, a lot of trauma, and the families do not have to go through the horror of listening to how their loved ones' lives were ended. He was given 8 concurrent life sentences in February 2019, and that means he won't be eligible for parole for 25 years. Sorry, am I in a coma? Did I just say that? He won't be eligible for parole in 25 years. It's at this point that I believe that the USA system of giving 1,500 years seems a little bit more accurate and appropriate for what I've just described. Genuinely. Now, don't get me wrong, he'll be 91 when he gets to that place of parole, and it's highly unlikely that he'll ever get out. But I don't know. I don't think that 25 years sounds very much at all. Now, the judge stated this: the ability to decapitate and dismember his victims and to do it repeatedly is pure evil. Yes, that's right, Judge. That's why we want 1,500 years and the death sentence all at once. Because I know and I appreciate this guy's not going to be able to get out on the streets and do anybody any more harm, but it's not the point, is it? As a family member, you just want to feel like stern justice have occurred. Due to the massive publicity of this crime, I mean, it was massive, clearly. This is a serial killer operating in Toronto for a long time. It meant that, well, how do I say this? Mcarthur struggled a little bit. Faced quite a tough time in prison. Yes, it appears that he was loathed not only by the public, but also by his fellow inmates. I'm smiling. It's highly inappropriate. I don't care. I think I can smile about him being loathed and having a horrible time and say, having a horrible time there, Santa. Anyway, in April 2019, he ends up getting seriously assaulted in his maximum security prison, Millhaven Institution. And we don't know what the actual injuries were. They weren't disclosed, but we do know that they were serious. I don't know. Hopefully it would mark the start of a pattern to his life in prison. Just throwing it out there. I don't think I'll lose any sleep if these assaults, just happen occasionally. Sorry, that sounds very violent, doesn't it? Where's my forgiveness, Emma? Where's my forgiveness? I don't have any. I have none. I'm actually hoping that he gets the train to hell really soon, genuinely. I think that the devil, the big D-E-V-I-L, has a huge list of exciting opportunities to, shall we say, play with Mcarthur in the future for the rest of eternity. It'll be hot, Mcarthur. It'll be hot. When you look at Mcarthur's victims, most of them were actually of Middle Eastern or South Asian descent. Now, this is quite unusual for a serial killer. We see it. We see it with somebody like Dahmer, for example, who certainly targeted particular individuals who were not his race. And we do see it play out occasionally with serial killers. But actually, serial killers on the whole target their own race. Now, some of the victims that Mcarthur went for, because of their religious background, they'd never come out of gay. So it made them more vulnerable. They led a secret life in the shadows. Perfect prey for Mcarthur. 2 of his victims have been homeless at times. They've been struggling with addiction. So again, high level vulnerability, perfect victims. And one of them was a refugee who was shortly going to be deported. So again, highly vulnerable. He targeted victims, firstly, that he did not believe would be missed, which is despicable. Yeah, he didn't value them at all. He thought no one values them. He wanted it to be difficult for those individuals to be traced back to him. So he went for married men who were secretly gay. And I think what's really telling about the darkness of this man's soul is that some of his victims were really close friends. He'd known Andrew Kinsman for a decade. They'd actually been in a sexual relationship for some time. Mcarthur had also known Skanda since the early 2000s. The pair had even dated. So it's almost as if that's how he lived his fantasy for long periods of time. They were dead men walking for a long period. They didn't know it, but he was living out his fantasies and working towards their murder for such a long time. It's just incomprehensible to imagine living in that mindset, dating these guys, knowing one day when I've had my full, when I'm ready, you're going to die. And these guys just turning up, hanging out, having sex, not for 1 minute believing this man had this potential. Now, killing Andrew, that had been Mcarthur's downfall, because the LGBTQ community set on fire wanting to find this man. He was an incredible advocate. They lost a member of their community that had great meaning. All people have great meaning, but in this community, Andrew stood out. So it was following this, of course, that the authorities actually managed to trace Mcarthur's vehicle. But before becoming a suspect in Andrew's murder, let's be honest, Mcarthur had had loads of encounters with the police. First of all, he'd had that violent attack on Mark Henderson in 2001. But Mcarthur had still been able to go ahead and murder another 8 men between 2010 and 2017, completely undetected. And due to his 2014 police record suspension, the true risk that he posed was never even properly identified. By the time his record was expunged, he'd already killed 3 people. Now, the authorities suspect, as I'm sure you will listening to this right now, that he's responsible for far more than 8 murders. Yeah, he's been convicted of killing 8 people, but the belief is there are loads more. Because he was a travelling salesman, wasn't he? In Ontario in the early 1990s. Perfect opportunity to procure a victim, kill a victim, dump a victim. And we know that organised serial killers do that, so we'll never likely know his true body count unless he decides to inform the authorities. Now, like I said, when it went to court, there wasn't an actual trial because he pleaded guilty. And that's important. It saved a lot of money and it saved some trauma. But it also means that the families lost the opportunity to have a lot of questions answered, because clearly in court, you often will hear pieces of information that you were not aware of. And it's not that it brings you closure, but it just fills in the gaps, because there are just countless questions in these situations. Now, the original investigations into the multiple disappearances, fortunately, were massively criticised. Yet the authorities were basically accused of only investigating the case after a white man disappeared. And it's true, that is what happened. So it's only when Andrew goes missing and people go crazy about it that suddenly people look at this case more seriously. And every single person, no matter what their race, no matter what their sexuality, they should be taken seriously. It's a life. But because the guys before who had disappeared were of Middle Eastern or Asian descent, they felt that basically there weren't investigations of a level that should have been expected. And there have been allegations ranging from general indifference by the police to racial factors. Now, authorities, of course, deny this. Guys, I think there might be some racism here, because you didn't seem to take it seriously that these men were disappearing. I find you are wrong. Why are we wrong? Because we say that we are not racist. I'm not sure the evidence suggests that you are not racist. We are not racist, and we are continuing to say this has nothing to do with why we didn't bother looking for these guys. We're not racist. I mean, I think probably racial factors did come in, didn't it? But the authorities say that's not the case. And they argued that Project Houston, which had investigated Scanda's disappearance, had actually been a bigger investigation than Andrew's. I can't comment on whether that's the truth. That's what they said. And furthermore, the authorities stated that as Andrew's disappearance had been reported within 72 hours, the investigators had been able to obtain evidence that would otherwise have been lost. So they were saying that crucial CCTV footage, which led to the identification of Mcarthur's vehicle, would have been lost if they hadn't got in there quickly. And that it was the fact that people rose the alarm that meant that actually Andrew's case was taken very seriously and they got this information very quickly. However, retired Ontario Court of Appeal Justice Gloria Epstein, she actually had a very different view. She led an independent review into Toronto's police services handling of the Mcarthur case. The report was published in April 2021, and it concluded the police could have done better. Sorry, just think that's such an ironic statement, isn't it? 8 men are dead. They didn't need to die. he should have been in prison for really, really, really violently attacking Mark, and you should have been aware of that, and he should have been on license. And your response is, could have done better. Yes, I could have written that report just doing my research. The police could have done better. I don't think that really maximizes the reality of what we're dealing with. Could have done better. I mean, it's not a biology exam where you didn't meet the average grade and you hadn't revised. Could have done better. It's not, I made a Victoria sponge, it's sunk in the middle because I opened my oven door. Could have done better. We're talking about people's lives. Surely could have done better doesn't really symbolise the actual gravity of the mistakes that were made. Anyway, she also makes 151 recommendations to the police, and she does actually, with respect, show complete dismay at the mishandling of Mark Henderson's case back in 2001. And the report concluded that the police prejudice played a part in the handling of Mark's case and subsequently the disappearances a decade later of all these men. Now, had Mcarthur have been convicted of that more serious offence for the attack on Mark, his details would have been in the database, he would have been flagged in any future investigations to the disappearances, and potentially he could have been stopped sooner, or he might never have carried out those killings I've covered today. Something we'll never know, but I bet it's something the victims' families must think about a great deal. And that's horrendous, isn't it? I still can't quite believe that the report said could have done better. I could have done better. I'm not even in Canada. I could have pieced that better than the police did. But again, doesn't it demonstrate that no matter where we are, there still remains and retains these biases? It is absolutely shocking to me, genuinely, that we're still in a situation where people's prejudice can play into how they decide to deal with crime. I mean, we're not talking about a long time ago. We think about Mark and what happened to him and how it affected his life. We think about men who, yes, were leading secret lives, just disappeared into thin air and connections weren't made appropriately. I think stories like this really make us ask the question, when are we going to get to a point where we equalise all life? It's precious. Whether you're a dependent, a sex worker, whether you're a partner who's married with children, whether you're an individual working in the church, whether you're a person of great wealth, your life is only equal to the life of another. Aside from serial killers and horrible murderers, their lives are worth considerably less. But you know what I'm saying? We've got to get to that point where when people disappear, we don't just think of them as missing people, because missing often turns to murder, and we should approach it that way. Today is Christmas Day. I've done a story with a Christmas theme. It doesn't feel very Christmassy having done it. That noted, you asked, I delivered. I hope that you found it interesting. It is blindsidingly bleak that these kind of humans exist. And as I hope and pray that Mcarthur spends the rest of his days being as terrorised by the prisoners that surround him as he terrorised his victims. Take care, guys. Have a mince pie for me. Have a drink. Remember, be safe. Here's to the next year. Loads of love.